Thank you for being here, Darian, and thank you for writing this book. I love the entire book, but I love the way that it wrapped up where you say it would be nice if psychoanalysts were to decide here whether they will devote their lives to proving to others and to themselves that everything Lacan said after 1963 is correct, or to continue the project that one assumes he had opened up for them.
Yeah, that's right. It seems more and more that people are concerned just to show that everything after 1963 is coherent, is non-contradictory, is correct, rather than actually doing some psychoanalytic research into the areas that Lacan had opened up for us. And I think that's particularly true when it comes to the way in which the term jouissance has come to be used in our circles. Originally, it is introduced at crucial moments in Lacan's work when he's grappling with a conceptual and clinical problem. But nowadays, we just use it very casually to classify a number of entirely disparate phenomena and processes. So it's almost become like a psychiatric label, which is used to refer to surface phenomena. So when we use the term jouissance, we tend not to ask the question, well, what exactly does it mean? Why is it there? What is it supposed to be accounting for? And crucially, in what way does it illuminate the fusion or coalescence of contradictory qualities, which is supposed to be a hallmark of jouissance?
Yeah, and I love the reference to Nestor's book. I just want to mention that as well, because Nestor recently passed away, of course. And so I just wanted to make sure to mention that as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's sad news. And in Nestor's book and in the paper that he published in English some years ago, he's very alert to that. And he was one of the first writers to point out the problematic use of the term jouissance and how so often we reduce Lacan to a kind of mid-Lacan focused on desire and a late Lacan focused on jouissance. And in Nestor's work, we find a challenging of that rather simplistic binary desire jouissance. And he raises a number of questions, especially in the book, about research. I think really he ends the book with the question of the superego, which is something obviously I focus on as well in my book. And it seems as if the more one considers what the term jouissance is supposed to be accounting for, the more one led towards these questions of superegoic formation and superegoic functioning.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Nestor's work, he's led to a distinction between a number of different forms of superego. And in my book on jouissance, I'm more interested in the perhaps more classical idea that was argued by Melanie Klein and Glover, that perhaps it was put forward rather tentatively by both authors, that just as we see classically the superego as the heir of the Oedipus complex, you could also see different superegoic inscriptions at the end of each of the prior libidinal phases. Yeah, so a very nice idea that would account for a lot of clinical phenomena. It just gets a bit more complicated when you question the idea of a neat division of libidinal phases, which again, I think the clinic really forces us to do. But there's some very important questions of the establishment of imperative structures in the psyche in the early years of life. How do we make sense of those? How do we theorize them? So that's the kind of question that I'm hoping to open up in the book. And just to make one other point about that question of the superego, as Lacanians, we tend to put a big emphasis on desire, and we don't tend to have so much of an interest in guilt. In Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, he says that really guilt is the fundamental problem that psychoanalysis has to deal with. And he introduces a model of the kind of economics of pain and suffering and punishment that had been elaborated at different moments in his work, but it's very, very clearly set out in the Civilization book. And yet it's something that's perhaps sadly neglected in Lacanian work today. When we talk about guilt, we usually evoke Lacan's discussions of guilt, which are absolutely topical, but we fail to see the context of those discussions. Lacan is arguing for models of guilt that weren't customary at the time, in the 50s and 60s. So we kind of lose out on that old Freudian model by only putting the focus on the other models of guilt that Lacan argues for example, in the transference seminar or in the ethics seminar.
And I really love the way that you do your analyses in this book because it's clear that, of course, you love Lacan and his work, but it's like you said, like opening up questions again, where things seem to have people seem to have a tendency to kind of want to lock things in place and argue theory and like put things in place instead of doing like the psychoanalytic work with the theory, which is like opening up more questions, opening up more possibilities. And you also go back and bring in these earlier theorists. With some, I always end up when I read your books having to go and like learn who new people are, and bringing in prior work to kind of make the theory more just having a larger bouquet of ideas in there rather than just like leaning on these like phrases and jargon that people keep throwing around.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, analytic groups tend to be bound together by shared beliefs and the need to believe in a theory or in a particular person. That's perhaps an aspect of all analytic groups and all human groups much more generally. But we lose out a great deal if we don't construct dialogues with other traditions and other writers analytically. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to encourage people to read British analysts, American analysts, other French analysts, analysts from different traditions, many of whom Lacan was very familiar with and entered into some kind of dialogue with, maybe was inspired by, but also to make new dialogues by bringing in what for me is very, very important work in the American tradition, and to see how that resonates with Lacanian work, how the two traditions can clarify each other, can illuminate certain questions, and can open up new ones. So really, I'm very pleased if people read the Jouissance book and then go off and read Erickson or Karen Stephen and the other authors who get a lot of space in the book.
Yeah, exactly. Karen Stephen I hadn't heard of before, and so now I've had to go and order her books.
Yeah, I mean, she was an amazing writer and theoretician. She's kind of using a slightly Kleinian but more Abrahamian model, which sees ambivalence and contradiction as central to all object relations. And what she's really interested in is how the body itself becomes a site of inscriptions of the other, of parental care, parental imperatives, parental enjoyment, parental pain, and how that fuses with the nascent biological and interpersonal processes that are being constructed for the infant and the child. So that work in particular, Psychoanalysis and Medicine, is an incredibly rich work, which reading it today is still full of surprises and can shed a lot of light on clinical and conceptual problems.
Absolutely. And you also brought up Eric Fromm, who I've been reading a lot lately because he does seem so relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you read what Fromm was saying about capitalism in the late 1930s, early 1940s, it's exactly what a lot of Lacanian writers say today, as if, this is all absolutely new theory, but, this is old stuff. But because Fromm isn't part of our tradition, we tend not to read it. Yeah. So again, it seems likely that Lacan followed Fromm's work. Certainly, he'd read the work from 1936 on authority and the family in the Adorno volume. And very probably he'd read the later work, Escape from Freedom, Fromm's work on being and having, Fromm's work on love. These are things that all have echoes and resonances in Lacan's work. But Fromm also focuses on a number of very pertinent problems in the politics of psychoanalysis that we can all, again, learn from today.
Oh, would you say more about that?
Yeah, one of the things that Fromm was interested in is group formation. It's a central topic in Escape from Freedom. And later on, in his book, which is a kind of collection of essays, The Crisis in Psychoanalysis, he's looking at ego psychology, and he was always a fierce critic of Austro-American ego psychology. And he's looking at how the politics of the analytic movement and the efforts to avoid criticism falling on Freud led to both clinical and theoretical paths which might have been different if people had been more willing to think about Freud and read Freud critically. That was one of the reasons, again, why Fromm kind of fell off the reading lists in a lot of analytic trainings around the world, certainly in the International Psychoanalytic Association, because of that critical edge. But reading those essays today is again, absolutely topical for our own analytic tradition.
Absolutely. And I was also interested to read that Thomas Szasz had one of the first references to Lacan in his work in
Yes,
English.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. I was surprised when I came across that. Lacan's referred to occasionally in the IPA, in the journal literature, every now and again. He's referred to in a few book-length studies before that. But really, this is the first, one of the first, as far as I know, references in a kind of mainstream publication by an IPA analyst. And again, it's a book that most people today aren't aware of. They know about his work as a critic of psychiatry, as a critic to a certain extent of psychoanalysis. But that book, again, is something that you hardly ever see referenced. And yet it's a very careful study of the relation of pleasure to pain and of moments and processes in which they fuse together.
Yeah, it was one that I didn't have, and I have several of his books. So there's another one that has been ordered thanks to you.
Yeah.
And I also love the way that you take theory and then bring it into current age. You always use like, current films and movies and things that are going on now to make it like very relatable. And I love this part where you talk about the primal father and the shift from like hoarding and enjoying all the women to the data hoarding.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, everyone today seems so sensitive to that these figures, the kind of oligarchs and tech billionaires, there's less fascination with their sex lives, but there's much more of a sensitivity to the idea that they're stealing something from us, they're amassing data and enjoying data. So we have this interesting shift in terms of that figure of the primal father across, maybe the last 30 years or so.
Yeah, it is a really interesting shift. And one of the other things that I love that you address, which is my biggest problem with the Lacanian theory and Lacanians, is this focus on they're really stuck in the binary and on these kind of old tropes of like men and women and their positions. And I just feel like if we stay stuck in that, we're really going to lose a lot of the next generation,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, when you look at Lacan's work, you have to see it as a historically situated work, just like Freud's was. And Lacan himself had no problem in situating Freud in a historical context, like many other critics of Freud, and seeing what the consequences of that historicization were on analytic theory and obviously by implication analytic practice. Yet we never seem to do the same with Lacan. We never seem to see him as a man of his time and situate, for example, what he says about men and women and about sexuality within the context of contemporary ideologies. And it does seem to be a great pity that Lacan didn't engage so much. It seems he didn't really read much of second wave feminism with their critiques of psychoanalysis, not just the obvious stuff about the castration complex, but the more careful critiques about the idea of the difference between women, about the difference between the individual and the sexual being, all stuff you find in the late 60s and early 70s, which could certainly have informed more a work like Seminar 20 Encore. So I think, we have to historicize it. And although Lacan's theories and remarks on sexuality, on sexuation, on male and female sexuality are still rich and important in many ways, we also have to bite the bullet and accept that perhaps not everything is correct, and we need to have open minds and learn from what we hear from patients, from people around us, from people outside psychoanalysis, to see how that can inflect and perhaps make us change our theories.
Yeah, exactly. And like here in Sweden, since I moved to Sweden, there I have met three Lacanian psychoanalysts, so they do exist. Per Magnus Johansson trained in Paris and then came back and has trained some other people, so that's wonderful. But for the most part, like they're in Gothenburg, but in Stockholm, when I was living in Stockholm, there's not really any Lacanian analysts. And when I presented at the Swedish Psychoanalytic Association there, no one had read Lacan. And so yeah, it was very difficult to talk to them, even though I really always try to present my papers in a way that you do too, where you don't use a lot of jargon so that people can read them even if they're not familiar with the theories already, which is great. But yeah, Lacan passed away in 1981, so it's not new theory. And I think for the time that he wrote, it was really progressive, and saying that anybody can take up these two positions, of course. But then, yeah, if he was still alive and writing, I'm sure he'd still be evolving his theory to this day.
But yeah, I agree, but I'm not sure how progressive it really was, because if you look at what other people were writing in the 60s before Lacan, you'll find ideas that were equally, perhaps even more progressive. For me, what's really important in that period is the American sociology of sexuality, which is pre-Foucault, and in many ways more important than Foucault. The idea of sexual scripts and the fusion of cultural, intrapsychical, and intersubjective processes there. You read that stuff today, it's still, absolutely acute and to the point and incredibly important, and very progressive in terms of the idea of movement between different sexual positions and how discourse allows or disallows that. So for me, there's much more subtle work that was done in the late 1960s than what we find in the Lacanian psychoanalysis of the 70s.
Very good point. And like to point out as well, like arguing like what a true woman is and this kind of thing can be really problematic.
It's ridiculous, yeah. And it's amazing that we still use that kind of language in our circles.
Yeah. Fernanda Magallanes, who's a psychoanalyst in Mexico, she wrote a great book called The Body and the Oedipal Plot, and she addresses a lot of that, of Lacan's using feminine jouissance and what a true woman is and stuff. So
yeah.
I'm glad it's being worked on and with.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just also have to mention the logo of Lacan's father's company. That was also such a nice kind of treat that you brought up, and how you said you joked that it would have like 3 rings, and then you looked it up and it actually found that it did, in fact, to which a 4th was added.
Yeah, that was quite surprising.
But also not.
but again, I mean, that's quite funny, and making that connection. But again, it's about historicizing. It's about not abstracting people from their historical, personal, biographical contexts. In the same way that we have no problem in linking Freud's work with his biography, whether we're using that in terms of a confirmation or a critique or some kind of dialectical reading. And yet we never really do that with Lacan. Yet, there's no reason why we shouldn't. It's not about disproving the theory, but it's about inflecting it and just putting it in historical context.
Yeah, and of course it makes sense that anytime people are developing their theory, they're developing it from their work and their perspective, and it's going to have their
Yeah,
history and their times in it. It just makes sense. I
yeah,
think it was
absolutely.
Jung that said, like, I don't want people to be Jungians. You should be whatever you are.
Yeah, I think the first person to say that, as far as I know, was Marx, who said it's
Mm,
for you to be Marxists. And then Freud said it himself. He said to his followers, it's up to you to be Freudians, but not me. And then, of course, Lacan says the same thing later on in the 70s.
exactly. So what are you working on now?
So now I'm writing a book about sexuality with a focus on sexual practice and the history of sexual practice. And one of the things that again I've found surprising and fascinating is the way that as psychoanalysts we're supposed to be obsessed with sex, but actually we know hardly anything about it. And so when patients tell us things about their sexual lives, we might ask a few questions, but we tend to be rather reserved and prudent, perhaps because we don't want to be seen to be too intrusive or too obsessed with sex in the way that the kind of old school popular image of analysts was about. But the people that are asking those questions, so people in the tradition of what was once called sexology, they've come up with a lot of remarkable research on things that as analysts we just don't know anything about. So in the book I'm trying to bring together, I read through the last I think 60 or 70 years of the sexology journals. So I'm trying to bring together what we can learn from that tradition and the tradition of erotic humor, jokes about sex from the last few centuries that have been studied by historians, to see what that can show us about changes and continuities in sexual practice, and hopefully trying to bring some analytic theory to those points where analysis hasn't really, you know, had much of, a possibility of research because we just don't have the data.
Wonderful. I love this about, the evolution of your work, and I love this about this field in general, is that there's like so much more to always explore.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we always think as analysts that we know everything about people's internal lives, but there are always questions that we won't ask, again, for no doubt historically, contextual, reasons. And when we tell people to free associate, obviously they free associate according to the architecture of their own resistances. Yeah. And so even if, we'll interrupt people and try and persuade them to talk about certain things, we do still tend to shy away from a lot of questions about sex. So, we can try to ask some of those questions in analytic practice and learn something, but we can also, as I was saying earlier, learn from the people that do ask those questions in other research traditions.
Yeah, exactly. That's the best way to kind of broaden the field and our own thinking. And that's what I try to do on the podcast too, is make sure I invite people from all different theoretical orientations and
Yeah.
just anyone working with kind of the body, mind, consciousness to kind of, yeah, broaden the field.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I really feel that psychoanalysis, could be so useful in these times, and what's going on with social justice and politics and gender and everything. I feel like it can add such a more nuanced view of
Yeah.
things.
Absolutely, but we have to be open to listen and learn from what people from the other traditions are saying. When, for a number, again, of historical reasons, as analysts, we've always tended to think we know much more than other people. And hence, we have a more condescending attitude to theoreticians, researchers from other traditions, because we sort of assume, they're not interested in the unconscious, hence their work is kind of automatically invalidated, which
Yeah, or
is,
limited in
great,
some
great
way.
pity. Yeah, it's a great pity. I mean, there are plenty of people that do work that doesn't take account of the unconscious, but still, can be, of the utmost interest.
Absolutely. And aren't we supposed to not uphold this position of the subject supposed to
Yeah,
know?
exactly.
In theory.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Was there anything else you wanted to mention? I want to make sure I give you a few minutes before your next appointment. I'm sure you have it the next hour.
Yeah, I'm not especially, not unless there's anything else you'd like to.
No, that's wonderful. I just wanted to hear, yeah, how about this book and whatever you have coming up next, which I look forward to.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks for having me on your podcast.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.